Hey, what's going on? Happy Wednesday. Doing a Facebook Live here. And if you're watching this on YouTube later, doing a quick uh, tip about triathlon and training in general. And this time I'm going to go over bike FTP because it's thrown around there a lot. Smart trainers, training by power is a lot more feasible these days. Power meters becoming more and more affordable. So if you're using a power meter, using a smart trainer and training by power, then hopefully you're aware what that FTP setting is really all about. So when you set it at 180 watts, 100 watts, 250 watts, 300 watts, people throw around this wattage, you really know what that means for you and how to best use it for your training. Because personally, when I build workouts like in Training Peaks and it gets exported to Zwift or Garmin or something like that, it's built based off FTP. So it goes off your FTP and its percentages based on that. So if you don't have a correct FTP is, you don't really understand what it is, you're kind of flying blind by the seat of your pants. So hopefully these quick little tips will kind of get you a little bit more up to speed. And as always, there's tons of information on the internet, but I'm trying to boil it down to you, something a little bit more digestible chunks. So FTP is functional threshold power. So what that means is it's the greatest mean maximal power per 1 hour. So technically it's the best maximal mean power, not the average, not the normalized power. As the mean power that you could produce over 60 minutes. So it's the best you could do for an hour. And that's just kind of what everything is based off of as far as power and FTP is that hour maximal effort. What can you get? And it can and it will change. And that's why my athletes and other platforms I use, Triathlon, have assessments for fitness assessments, FTP bike assessments. So every month, maybe, or every 4 to 6 weeks, you're doing an FTP assessment to see where it's at. You know, if you dropped, you're taking some time off. So you don't want to be training FTP that was 200, now it's down to 150. Or you don't want to be training at 200 when your FTP is 250. So you don't want to be under or overtraining. So you need to make sure you got your assessments so you know where your FTP is at. So to understand FTP, you kind of dig into the weeds a little bit. So you need to know that lactate threshold factors in, and that lactate is what you feel after you've been biking or running or anything like that. Your muscles, it just gets harder and harder to fire the muscles, and your legs just feel full and like they're gonna explode. That's what lactate threshold is. It's the lactic acid building up in your muscles and really getting in there and prohibiting you from putting out that effort that you're doing. So that lactate threshold determines your percent of your VO2 usage. So you have your VO2 max in addition to FTP. So you set that up, but that's not something you can access at all times. You could try to get to that VO2 max and try to operate that as long as possible, but you're gonna burn out pretty quick. So that lactate threshold determines what percentage can you access 50% of that VO2 when you're doing workouts or anything. You know, that lactate threshold is going to determine where you can get to and what your cap is as far as reaching that VO2. That lactate threshold is a marker for your fuel type and your muscle fatigue. So it's going to determine at what point are you using fats versus carbs and how much of your muscle recruitment that you can use during your workout and during your training. So it's your cap. It's your marker of saying you're at this much fat versus carb burning and you're at this percentage of your VO2. So that's what lactate threshold is really good for, is marking those different levels, you know, where you cap at and where maybe you could go as far as aerobic capacity and what your tempo capacities are. So that lactate threshold is expressed in watts and it counts for efficiency. So that's the translation. So what's going on with your body, then we're translating it to watts that you can measure on your bike. So that's just a measurement tool to kind of, overall, we're measuring those lactate threshold markers of what you can do, your best effort you can do over an hour, but we're putting it in watts. So it's something that's measurable that we can all go out and we can use on our bikes and use on our smart trainers, use on our smart training platforms. So it's expressed in watts and accounts for efficiency. Your max power, and I'm trying to understand my notes. So maximum power in watts fighting LTP. So what you're doing is when you're doing your riding, you're fighting your lactate threshold over time. So as you cycle more and more, you're going to get more and more fatigued. So when we're looking at FTP, that's going to be the max power in watts while you're fighting your lactate threshold. So, you know, whatever is it 250 watts is where you kind of peter out, is where your muscles can no longer fire and you're no longer burning, carbs versus fats efficiently. So that's going to be the marker, and your max power relates to your FTP. So maybe that's the link that I'm looking for. That FTP is that max power in watts when you're fighting your LTP, your lactate threshold. So there's a couple different ways you can test it to find out for your FTP. You could do tests with blood samples. So you go out there and you do an hour test, and you come in and they test your blood for it, which is pretty invasive, and people don't have the time, and usually that's pretty expensive. But you can do your field test. So if you haven't trained with me, in my training plans also, I've got a 20-minute TT test. I like to do it on the trainer, so you don't have to worry about, today in Kansas, we've got 50-mile-per-hour wind gusts. So if you're set up for an FTP test, it's going to be very difficult. You're going to be fighting the elements, and you want as consistent as possible every time you do the test. So for that 20 minutes, you're going to see what power you can hold, and that becomes your FTP, where you derive your FTP, because it's actually, you do your field test, you get your average power, not your normalized power, average power, 95% of that, in order to estimate your FTP for an hour. I mean, you can go out there and do a time trial for an hour, but most of us don't go out there and purely suffer for an hour to get what that FTP is. So the 20-minute test is condensed. It's still not fun, but it's probably more fun, if that's possible, than the 60-hour FTP test. So you go out there, average power over 20 minutes, 95% of that, and that is going to be your FTP. And that is at what point your body starts saying, I'm producing enough. Here's your lactate threshold of where you can't produce any more power, and you're actually going to start going downhill because you've gotten so much lactate built up. You're not going to produce anymore, and this is your cap. And that's what sets up everything as far as me, my coaching, of doing your biking workouts and doing your power and everything. So that field test is what I use. I don't like people to use, don't have to use blood tests and stuff. Field test is pretty good, and pretty much like most of your platforms use it. I use it in Training Peaks. I use it and try it out for my athletes. So the FTP and power, I bring that up because it's, like I said, it's the next level of training. So if you're getting smart trainers to measure the power, if you're getting power meters, pedals, if you're getting a crank arm power meter, if you're getting a hub, however you're getting your power meters, know what you're doing with your power meter, and know what FTP is, the functional threshold power, and what it really means. It's just it's a way to measure output of your body to see what's going on the inside. So to get that FTP, you stress yourself out for 20 minutes, 95% of that, and that is at the point that lactate threshold takes over, to where you're kind of gassed out, you can't do any better, and you're going to fall off the cliff, and you're not going to be able to do much more of that. And that sets you up for the workouts when you're doing 95% of your FTP, when you're doing 50% of your FTP. So don't just guess. Do a 20-minute test if you can, if you got the tools, if you got the equipment to access it. So then you know what your FTP is, and then you can set up your bike training and utilize the tools that you got. Like I said, everybody's always talking about power and power meters. So if you don't understand what you're doing with it, it doesn't make it quite as an effective tool. So hopefully that kind of sheds a little bit of light. This is supposed to be quick tips, so we didn't dive too much into it, but hopefully it helped you out. If you got questions, put them in the comments. Again, this will also be on YouTube later, so if you see it on there, put it in the comments, send me a message, do whatever you got to, and I'll try to get back to you. And hopefully you're having a good day out there, and happy training, and we'll see you on race day.